Hi, everyone. Welcome. Happy Friday, and thanks for joining us. My name is Robert. I'll be your host. This is the Abraham Lincoln Assassination in Ford's Theater live stream online virtual tour. Thanks so much for being here. Let's go ahead and get started. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln took place 158 years ago. Lincoln was shot on April 14th, 1865, which was Good Friday, and then he died the following morning, the early morning hours of April 15th, 1865. And every year, we either have a live in-person event at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., or since COVID, we've been having these online virtual live stream programs. So thanks so much for being here. So this is a picture of the tour, the in-person tours that we do at Ford's Theater. These are temporarily on hold for various reasons, but we'll start them back up at some point in time. So if you're ever in Washington, D.C., or if you live there and you want to come check us out, we'll have a tour at some point in time. Hopefully later this summer, we'll have our next in-person tour of Ford's Theater. And then we also, what we do is we walk around the neighborhood around Ford's Theater and kind of check out all these sites that are within walking distance of Ford's Theater to learn more about the Lincoln assassination. And that's me in the hat holding up the visual. And my name is Robert Kelleman. I'll be your host. So again, thanks so much for being here. Happy Friday. And we have our amazing, spectacular, and illustrious co-host joining us, Patty. Hi, Patty. How are you doing?
Robert, you have to stop making me laugh just before you want me to talk. But I appreciate your flattery anyway. I'm doing well.
We appreciate you, Patty. More than you can imagine.
Well,
we make a great team.
I have a good time doing this stuff, and I hope the all of our guests really enjoy it. And I'm doing well tonight. Congratulations on finishing your project. All of us are excited that you might be back in our sphere again. So yeah, looking forward to what, I don't know if you noticed, I dropped a little note in the chat with a wink. How every time I hear Asha Khan Farewell, it does make me long to watch that series all over again.
Well, hang in there, because I'm actually going to be streaming it later this summer. So I bought the DVD set a few weeks ago. People make donations to our organization, and so I took some of the donation money and I purchased the whole entire DVD set. And so I was actually going to stream the whole entire Ken Burns Civil War series. I was going to do it starting around early July, because actually this July is the 160th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. So
that's right. Harry and I were talking about that the other night, actually. Yeah.
Yeah. So stay tuned. We're actually going to be streaming the Civil War series, so you can hear more of that music.
So I didn't need to put the wink in there, huh? I was afraid you would think I was harassing you, but what I said.
No. That's actually like half the programs that we develop are ideas and suggestions from people. I don't have all these creative ideas. I get them from all of you guys. Well,
Leslie's on board with it. She's really excited about a group showing of it. So
excellent. Thank you. All right. Well, thanks, Patty. Thanks again for joining us. And of course, thanks for everyone else. So this is the Abraham Lincoln Assassination and Ford's Theater Tour. And this was such a monumental and tragic event. You can't talk about it in just 90 minutes. So it really has two parts to it. So tonight we're going to talk about the Lincoln assassination, and we'll do kind of like a online or a virtual live stream tour of Ford's Theater. And then our next program, which if you're watching this live, will be 2 weeks from tonight on Friday, April 28th. It's using the same Zoom link. So if you signed up with us through Meetup or Eventbrite, we'll see you then. If you haven't signed up, don't worry. Just save this same Zoom link, and 2 weeks from tonight, same time, same place, we'll do the talk about the Lincoln assassination conspirators, John Wilkes Booth and his counterparts, and what they were trying to accomplish. And then what we used to do back in the day before COVID is we used to schedule or organize these bus trips where we would leave Washington, D.C., and we would go travel to all the sites that John Wilkes Booth visited when he was trying to escape. And so there'll be kind of like a online or virtual like road trip, so to speak. So you can look out for that. And again, this program is being recorded on our Washington, D.C. History and Culture YouTube channel. So if you are watching us in the future on YouTube, you can look out for both programs. All right, so let's talk about Ford's Theater, the site itself. One thing that note about the site is it does have course, a lot of information about the assassination of President Lincoln, but it does much more than just that. They really try and focus also on Abraham Lincoln's life and his legacy. It's not just strictly the assassination. And just for myself personally, the very first time I visited Washington, D.C., I was there for a week over Thanksgiving and went and saw all the touristy stuff like the Capitol and Arlington Cemetery and the Smithsonian's memorials. And the Ford's Theater site was the one that really had an impact on me personally, just because of the trajectory that the country went on after the Lincoln assassination, the fact that he was struck down, one of my heroes, and just reading about this site and learning about it growing up, and then to finally see it in person, it was a really moving experience. So if you haven't had a chance to visit it, make sure you do so. And here's a picture of Ford's Theater from back in the day. This picture was taken the same time that Lincoln was assassinated, just to give you some notice. The streets are dirt. And then here it is, a picture today. So the front of the building is the same that was there when Lincoln was alive. The inside has been redone. The building's had some kind of structural problems over the course of its time, but it's been pretty amazing to walk back in time and go through this time travel to go inside Ford's Theater. So I have a few videos to show you, short videos throughout our program, just so you can get kind of more of a 3D sense of what's at Ford's Theater. So let's cue up the first one.
Ford's Theater, where Lincoln's legacy lives. During the Civil War, Ford's Theater provided a respite for many. President Abraham Lincoln visited the theater on 12 known occasions, saying, "Some think I do wrong to go to the opera and to the theater, but it rests me. I love to be alone and yet to be with people. A hearty laugh relieves me, and I seem better able after it to bear my cross." On April 14, 1865, Lincoln's reprieve from the burdens of daily life was interrupted by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Booth snuck into the president's box at Ford's Theater during a performance of Our American Cousin and shot the president. Lincoln died the next morning at the Petersen House across the street. For more than 100 years, the theater was closed, finally reopening in 1968 as a fully functioning theater and National Historic Site celebrating the life and legacy of our 16th president. Through its inspiring theatrical productions, live historic interpretation, and engaging educational programs, Ford's Theater is the premier destination in the nation's capital for all audiences to learn about Abraham Lincoln, our country's history, and its relationship to the America of today. Each year, the theater presents renowned plays, vibrant musicals, and newly commissioned works that captivate and entertain while examining important political and social issues related to the Lincoln legacy. Immersive programming such as the History on Foot walking tours bring Civil War Washington to life. Lincoln's values and ideals are passed on to future generations through a variety of education programs, including special oratory initiatives, teacher development, and long-distance learning opportunities. The museum features a rich collection of artifacts and exhibits highlighting Lincoln's major achievements as president and the events leading up to his assassination. In the new Center for Education and Leadership, visitors explore the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination and the lasting impact of his legacy on our country. The center features both permanent and rotating exhibits, as well as education studios. Ford's Theater is a historic site like no other. Through the dynamic intersection of history, performance, and education, visitors rediscover the American president against whom all others are measured.
Okay, so there you have it, a quick video introduction to Ford's Theater. So this is standing outside of Ford's Theater. And if you haven't been to Washington, D.C., one of the big tourist attractions is the National Mall, and Ford's Theater is just north of the National Mall. It's just a few blocks north of the National Mall. It's also just a few blocks, maybe like a half a mile from the White House. It's kind of in between the White House and the Capitol, just to give you that geographic frame of reference. And I thought what I would do for the program tonight is, if you're going to be visiting at some point in time in the future, I thought I'd give you some suggestions from my own personal experiences visiting Ford's Theater on numerous occasions, so that you can maximize your visit. And so the first one would be to reserve your tickets in advance. So the tickets, there's a nominal fee to visit Ford's Theater. It's just a few dollars, but if you're going to be visiting, it's probably a good idea to reserve your tickets in advance. You can do so online or in person. And the reason being is because during tourist season, like if you show up during the Cherry Blossom Festival or a holiday weekend, or like the weekends in the summer, the tickets might be sold out. So it'd really be disappointing if you showed up at Ford's Theater hoping to go through and there were no tickets available that day, because there is it's a limited capacity type of venue. So my recommendation is to get your tickets in advance. And you don't need to reserve them like a week or 2 weeks in advance. Usually just a day or two will be fine. So just something to keep in mind. And then another thing, if you visit Ford's Theater, is to make sure that you budget enough time to visit. There's 4 different components, and you actually want to visit all 4. So most people are focused on just seeing the theater itself, which is where Lincoln was shot. But there's actually 3 other aspects of it. And so what you want to do is you show up and you visit the museum first, and I'll walk through some of the things that you could see in the museum exhibits. And then you go upstairs and you walk through the theater, and then you go across the street and you visit what's known as the Petersen House. This is actually where they took Abraham Lincoln after he was shot and where he died. And then you go next door and they have these aftermath exhibits. So I have to be honest with you, it is very depressing and sad to learn about the tragic story of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, but it's a little bit uplifting to go to the aftermath exhibits and then see the impact that Lincoln has had not only on our nation, but on the entire world after his death. So keep that in mind. There's 4 different components, and you could probably spend easily a half a day there, maybe even longer. So something for you to keep in mind. And this is the inside of the museum exhibit. So this picture here, this large picture where people stand here and take selfies and stuff, is in the museum exhibits. And then they have this really cool sculpture of Lincoln, which is another popular photo spot. And Lincoln reading a book. So a life-size sculpture of him. And then there's a close-up. And so I thought what I would do is show you what the inside of the museum looks like, so you can get kind of a sneak preview and an appreciation for what might be there. So the exhibits talk about the life of Abraham Lincoln up to the time of the assassination. It talks about the election of 1860, which was one of the most hotly contested elections in American presidential history. Lincoln won that, of course, beating 3 other competitors. And then this was a section I thought was really, really interesting. It was Washington, D.C. in the 1860s. What was it like to live in Washington, D.C. during the time of Abraham Lincoln? And so they have these exhibits that talk about that, like what kind of housing did people have, and what kind of jobs were available, and what did they eat? What did they do for entertainment, and all that kind of stuff. So I thought this was really well done. And then there's a section about Abraham Lincoln living in Washington, D.C. Now, unfortunately, we have so much ground to cover tonight. We can't go into great detail in some of these exhibits, but you could easily spend an hour, I would say, going through these. You could probably do it in like 15 or 20 minutes if you're restless and impatient. But if you wanted to kind of read all the things that are there, you could probably easily spend an hour there. One of the things that's really fascinating is that Washington, D.C., at the start of the Lincoln administration was actually a really small town. There were only 60,000 people living in Washington, D.C., and most of them were living between the Capitol and the White House, or between the Capitol and Georgetown, if you're familiar with the D.C. area. Now, the Washington, D.C. metro area has a population of 5.3 million people. So D.C. was not the big, expansive metro area that it is today. Of course, it talks about some of the accomplishments of Abraham Lincoln, including the Emancipation Proclamation, where Lincoln met with his cabinet and decided to start the process of freeing the enslaved persons. And so a variety of exhibits on things like that. And our program is mostly going to focus on the assassination. But again, I just wanted you to kind of see some of these other things that they have, because the museum does not only focus on the assassination, it focuses on the life and legacy of Lincoln. So this particular part of the experience is really about the life of Lincoln. This talks about the revolving door of Union generals, all these different Union generals that came and went, that Lincoln was trying to get to win the war before he finally settled on Ulysses S. Grant. And so as you can see, you could spend a good deal of time looking at all these different items. And then Lincoln and his 1864 running mate, Andrew Johnson, and they end up winning re-election 1864. There was a little bit of debate leading up to the election of 1864, whether or not Lincoln was going to be re-elected, because the war, the Civil War, was not going well for much of the Lincoln first term in office. But by the time the election of 1864 rolled around, things had improved. Lincoln's popularity increased, and he ends up winning re-election. Now, I thought what I would do is let's go through some dates of the events leading up to and immediately after the assassination, because there's all these really interesting things that take place around the time of the assassination, and just so you can get kind of a historical context of what took place. So back then, the president was inaugurated on March 4th. Today, the date is January 20th, but back at that point in time, the inauguration was on March 4th. So Lincoln had his second inauguration just a few weeks before he was shot on April 14th. And then if you see the dates going back and forth between April 14th and April 15th, that's because Lincoln was shot around 10:15 in the evening on Friday, April 14th, and he died at 7:35 the following morning on April 15th. So if you see dates associated with the Lincoln assassination, you see April 14th and April 15th, and it's going back and forth and trying to wonder what happens. That's because Lincoln was shot on the 14th, but he died on the 15th. And interestingly enough, or ironically enough, one of the people in attendance at the Lincoln assassination was none other than John Wilkes Booth. So you can see in this photo here, they've highlighted where Lincoln was standing. And back here is John Wilkes Booth. And Booth was actually armed. And he talked about to friends of his later that he could have very easily pulled out his gun and shot Lincoln from where he was standing because he was so close to him. So very ironic that Booth was so close to Lincoln at that point in time. And Lincoln, of course, is the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military during the Civil War. This is a famous painting of Lincoln meeting with his three key military men. And this is shortly before the end of the war. So what's happening here is they're discussing the plans for the South after the war is over. And so you can see this painting is really touching because there's a rainbow back here, which kind of signifies the end of the storm, so to speak, of the Civil War. So very symbolic. And Lincoln is listening to, again, his three top military men as they discuss the strategy or the plans for the South once the Confederates finally surrender, which is about to take place very, very soon. Oh, and this painting is called The Peacemakers. It actually hangs at the White House, FYI. And then just 2 weeks, less than 2 weeks before Lincoln is assassinated, the Confederates evacuate Richmond. So the Union Army had encircled most of Richmond several months earlier. There was this siege taking place between Ulysses S. Grant's Union Army and Robert E. Lee's Confederate Army. And eventually the siege took its toll on Lee and the Confederates, and they were forced to flee the capital. And so that took place on Sunday, April 2nd. So less than 2 weeks before Lincoln was assassinated, the Confederates flee the capital. There was fires that were lit to prevent things from falling into the Union Army's hands. And then the next day, Monday, April 3rd, the Union Army came marching into Richmond. So this was a really key day of the Civil War. This wasn't the end of the Civil War. There was still a lot of fighting and other activity to take place, but the fact that the Confederates lost their capital, which the two sides have been battling over since the beginning, was a very significant date. And then the next day, Tuesday, April 4th, Lincoln actually visited Richmond. And he did so with a pretty small group of military men. So you can see this is a contemporary depiction of this event. So here's Lincoln and his son. And yeah, there's a handful of Marines that are guarding him, but not all that many. And again, this is the former Confederate capital. And so pretty amazing to think that Lincoln was assassinated in his own capital when just 10 days earlier he had visited the Confederate capital, but he was unharmed during that time. A lot of African Americans came out to greet him, kind of like his thanks for helping to liberate them from slavery. And Lincoln traveling through the streets of the city. This is another historical depiction. Interestingly enough, there's no known photographs of Lincoln in Richmond. And you might be wondering, well, how could that possibly be the case? Well, they didn't have the large White House press pool like they do now. And then all the other photographers were attached to Grant and Lee's army, and they had followed them west to Appomattox or in that vicinity. So there were no photographers really around to take pictures of this event. But interestingly enough, it did take place on Tuesday, April 4th. And then a few days later, on April 9th, Robert E. Lee finally surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant. So notice the assassination takes place on the 14th. Lee surrendered to Grant on the 9th. So this also was not the end of the Civil War. There was still a decent amount of fighting that took place after April 9th, but this was really the death blow of the Confederacy, so to speak. When Lee surrendered, he had the large section of the army, and once he decided to lay his arms down, it really leads to kind of a domino effect for the rest of the Confederates. And so there's a lot of famous depictions. If you ever get a chance, you should visit Appomattox. Really interesting and fascinating historical site to see. And then to kind of celebrate the fact that Lee had surrendered, Lincoln gave an impromptu speech on the balcony of the White House. So when news, you have to remember 1860s news traveled a lot slower than it did today. So when news got up to Washington, D.C. that Lee had surrendered, there was all kinds of celebrations taking place in the city, and a large crowd gathered outside the White House. This was back in the day when you could actually go walk up and stand outside the White House. You can't do that anymore, of course. And so all these large groups of people are out there and they're chanting Lincoln's name and they're singing and celebrating and stuff. And so Lincoln came out on the balcony and delivered a short impromptu speech. And this is Tuesday, April 11th. And so this was Lincoln's last speech. And then a picture of that. And then here is some info on the speech. On the night of April, so this is actually from the Ford's Theater exhibit. On the night of April 11th, 2 days after Lee surrendered to Grant, Lincoln gave his last speech. A crowd gathered outside the White House calling for the president. Lincoln stood at the window just above the main door. Reporter Noah Brooks held a light so that the president could read. It had already gotten dark by then. Lincoln's son Tad gathered his father's pages as they fluttered to the floor. And in his speech, it's important because Lincoln talked about the fact that he wanted the former enslaved African Americans to have citizenship and the right to vote and things like that. And it just so happens that in the audience is John Wilkes Booth. And Booth was an extreme racist. And when he heard the fact that Lincoln wanted to give full citizenship to the African-American community, he was enraged by that. Booth was enraged by Lincoln's commitment to doing that. And so that's one of the things that ends up leading to Booth deciding to shoot Lincoln, one of many things. And then the night before the assassination, on Thursday, April 13th, they had this event that became known as the Grand Illumination. So what people did to celebrate the fact that Lee had surrendered is they put candles in their windows and they were turning on all the lights that they had. People were shooting off fireworks and guns. It was kind of maybe sort of like a 4th of July type celebration, but it wasn't 4th of July, of course, but that kind of festive atmosphere. So there was mass celebrations throughout the city. And so this takes place just the day before Lincoln was assassinated. People that were in Washington, D.C. during this time, they called it the greatest celebration that Washington, D.C. had ever seen in its history. And this was just the day before the Lincoln assassination, which took place the following day on Good Friday. Now, Lincoln was under a lot of stress while he was president of the United States. So what did he do in his free time? Like, how did he relax? How did President Lincoln relax from the stresses of the presidency? Did he go play golf? Did he send tweets? No, of course, he didn't do any of those things. He went to the theater. That was like his favorite pastime, along with reading books. And so while he was in Washington, D.C., he visited the theater on a regular basis. And because we're at Ford's Theater, they have a lot of exhibits related to that. So that's how he ends up at Ford's Theater on the night he was shot. It was common for Lincoln to visit the theater. It was one of his main diversions because they didn't have golf and tweeting and TikTok and all that other stuff back then. And it just so happens that on the night of Good Friday, he was going to see a play called Our American Cousin, which was a comedy, which was really kind of appropriate. Most of the plays that Lincoln went to go see were Shakespearean performances, but this particular one was a comedy, which would be a nice reprieve because the war was winding down, so he could chuckle after the stressful 4 years of the Civil War. But of course, he did not get to see the entire play. And then these are reproduction of tickets from back then. All right, so let's talk about John Wilkes Booth. We'll talk more about Booth and his conspirators in the Part 2 program, which will be taking place 2 weeks from tonight. Booth was born in 1838. He died in 1865. He was a famous actor. He was one of the most famous Americans at that time. Really well known. I can't really think of like a contemporary person that he'd be similar to, but just he was very, very well known. His whole family was very well known. His brothers and his father. He was a Southern sympathizer. He was born and raised in Maryland. Maryland had kind of mixed sympathies, so to speak, in the years and days leading up to the Civil War. He had what I would call extremist views. He was not very moderate in terms of his political opinions. He was a racist. You can read quotes that he spoke or wrote about his racist tendencies. They're out on the internet. I'll show you one a little bit later. And he essentially blames Lincoln for all the South's misery and suffering that took place during the Civil War. So in Booth's eyes, Lincoln is the person largely and mostly responsible for all the problems that the South is facing militarily, economically, socially, etc. during the Civil War. He wants to avenge that. And so he enlists this group of friends and counterparts that share in some of his ideas and beliefs. And so these are the men that would be involved. These three guys at the top were actually involved in the Lincoln assassination. These three guys were not directly involved in the events that took place on the night of the Lincoln assassination, but they were part of Booth's team and they were planning other activities, so to speak. And then when you go to the Ford's Theater Museum, they have profiles of all these people. So they have these interesting life-size sculptures of these people. So like, for instance, Mary Surratt, she's very well known, et cetera, et cetera. And so they have profiles of these different people. And it's kind of interesting just to walk up to them and see what they look like and put a name with a face and learn about their history and et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Booth is the most famous of this group. He was the leader of the group. It was an informal group of people that did not like Lincoln. And so kind of interesting to go through. Then again, if we had more time, we would talk about some of these exhibits in more detail, but we'll discuss the conspirators in the part 2 of our program. Just wanted you to kind of see what they have on display. And then, of course, there's Booth himself lurking in the shadows. So during the Civil War, they did not have the Secret Service protection of the president like they do now. You might be surprised to know that Lincoln and his wife, Mary, actually traveled the streets of Washington walking and in carriages and on horseback, Lincoln himself, oftentimes without any protection whatsoever. Sometimes he was accompanied by a bodyguard or members of the military, but oftentimes he was not. In fact, this is a print that came from the local newspaper announcing the fact that Lincoln and his wife Mary had gone out for a walk the day before. And so it was kind of a common thing for them to do. So if someone wanted to harm Lincoln, it would not have been that difficult during the Civil War, because oftentimes he was not accompanied by anyone. Sometimes he was and sometimes he wasn't, but it wasn't very consistent. And a place the Lincolns would often go to was this site that was known as the Soldiers' Home. It's now called President Lincoln's Cottage. It was kind of like their weekend getaway. And it was a little bit away from the White House, in an area that was kind of more cooler temperature-wise, so to speak. And so, in an era before air conditioning, Washington, D.C., it's really hot in the summer and humid. And so he could go to the Soldiers' Home where it was cooler and get a respite from the heat. And Lincoln would often ride his horse there. Sometimes he would be driven by carriage, but he would oftentimes ride his horse. Sometimes he'd be accompanied by a military group of cavalrymen. Sometimes a few times he was known to go by himself. And so Booth knows about this. Booth knows that Lincoln goes to this Soldiers' Home on a regular basis during the weekends. And he thinks that, I could probably take advantage of that knowledge. But if you get a chance, you really should check out President Lincoln's Cottage. It's a really interesting site to see. It's a little bit north of Ford's Theater, so you can go check that out. And they have a lot of programs on there. So my suggestion is to make a separate visit to President Lincoln's Cottage and learn about this kind of weekend White House place. This was before Camp David, of course. So Booth and his conspirators decide what they're going to do is, when Lincoln travels up to the cottage, they're going to intercept him and kidnap him. And then what they'll do is they'll somehow get him to the southern line, the southern states, where the Confederates are, and they'll hold him for ransom. So this is what Booth is initially planning on doing with his fellow conspirators. There was one day in particular where it was announced that Lincoln was going to be going out to the cottage, and Booth and his men were waiting to ambush Lincoln's party. They thought they could surprise them, overpower the guards, get Lincoln, blindfold him, tie him up, whatever, put him on a horse, flee out of town without anyone noticing, take him to the Confederate lines, and then hold him for ransom, either for Confederate prisoners or maybe, who knows, maybe even to the end of the war. So this is Booth's initial plan. His initial plan was not to assassinate Lincoln. It was to kidnap him and take him south. And he was thinking the ideal time to do that would be when Lincoln was traveling from the White House to the Soldiers' Home. He didn't want to do it when Lincoln was walking around downtown with his wife, because there were too many people around. But at that point in time, the Soldiers' Home was in kind of like a rural area. And so there was not a lot of, say, traffic, so to speak, on the road between the White House and the Soldiers' Home. And so they could have easily intercepted them. And it just so happened that this one particular day, Lincoln was supposed to be traveling to the Soldiers' Home, and Booth and his men are waiting, ready to ambush him. Lincoln at the last minute changed his plans and ended up doing something else. And so Booth was pretty disappointed about that. However, though, after Lee's army surrendered, Booth's idea of kidnapping Lincoln was no longer viable, because Lee had surrendered all of his troops. And so while the Civil War is still going on, the impact of being able to kidnap Lincoln and negotiate him for something was greatly diminished. So Booth was really distraught when he heard the news of Lee's surrender, like many people with Southern sympathies were. And it really kind of puts his plan of kidnapping Lincoln on hold. It was something that he had been working on for months, off and on. And so now it's on hold. And this is Mary Surratt, and she had a boarding house in Washington, D.C. And President Andrew Johnson would famously say later that, quote, she kept the nest in which the egg was hatched, the egg being the assassination plot against Lincoln. And here's a picture of Mary Surratt's house from several decades ago. And then here's a illustration of what it looked like back at that time. So this is Mary Surratt's boarding house. This building still stands in Washington, D.C. So Mary Surratt, she famously had this boarding house in Washington, D.C. John Wilkes Booth knew her son, John Surratt, and John Wilkes Booth were friends. And Booth would often visit this site, and the two of them were planning the kidnapping of Abraham Lincoln. And the building still stands, although it's not a museum. It's the infamous Rock and Roll restaurant, a pretty good restaurant to check out. So if you're wondering, like, what does Chinese food have to do with Abraham Lincoln? Well, not really anything other than the fact that they took over this building and they've restored it. And so the upstairs rooms are used for like karaoke and stuff and private parties. And then downstairs is a restaurant. So if you get a chance, this is actually just a few blocks from Ford's Theater. It's pretty neat to walk over here and check this out. So you might want to do that. There's a historical marker out front talking about the Lincoln conspirators and Mary Surratt. And then here's that quote, the nest in which the egg, the assassination plot against Lincoln, was hatched. And then this is a map. This is like a walking tour of like a self-guided walking tour that you can take of sites around Washington, D.C. So that's pretty cool. These historical markers are put up by our friends at the nonprofit organization Cultural Tourism DC. They do a great job of putting up these different markers throughout the city. So shout out to them. And then when you go inside the Rock and Roll restaurant, the former Mary Surratt house, you can see historical landmark, Surratt Boarding House, 604 H Street Northwest, if you know where that is in Washington, D.C. This is interesting to me, is said to have been where the conspirators plotted the abduction of U.S. President Abraham Lincoln. It's not is said to have been, it is the site where it was planned. I'm not sure why it says that, but hey, that's what it says. All right, so let's talk about Booth shooting Lincoln. He snuck up behind him and shot him in the back of the head, as depicted in this famous print. And so we're still in the museum at Ford's Theater talking about some of the things that they have on display. So they actually have the gun that Booth used to shoot Lincoln. Here it is, right here. And then this is not the actual bullet, but it's a reproduction that shows you how small the bullet was. And so there's Booth looking very unhappy, yet determined. And there's Lincoln sitting there very peacefully watching his play. A single shot. After John Wilkes Booth shot the president at close range with his single shot Derringer, he dropped the pistol on the floor of the theater box. Pulling out his knife, he swiftly moved to jump over the balcony, grappling momentarily with Major Henry Rathbone, a guest of the Lincolns. Rathbone was severely cut in the brief scuffle with Booth and suffered major blood loss. In fact, he would have died if he had not got medical treatment. That is Major Henry Rathbone. Booth's Derringer was later discovered on the floor of the box, the theater box, and turned over to the military authorities as they began to gather evidence in their investigation of the assassination of President Lincoln. And there is the Derringer. So this is the Derringer that shot Lincoln and changed the trajectory of American history in the process. And these aren't my hands, these are the curator's hands holding it. My personal experience, people seeing this pistol, this Derringer, people that aren't familiar with guns are surprised how small it is. It's not very big. There's a lot of questions as to why Booth chose this particular gun. John Wilkes Booth owned a number of weapons, it's thought that perhaps he picked this gun because it was very small. He could easily slip it in his pocket. The downside is it only had one shot. So if he had a problem with the gun, he would have had to use his knife. But anyway, that's the gun that shot Lincoln. The gun that killed Abraham Lincoln. With a single shot, John Wilkes Booth changed the course of American history. The gun he chose is a .44 caliber pistol made by Henry Derringer of Philadelphia. One shot was all that Booth had. And so this is the size of the bullet. It's really about the size of a pea. So if you can picture the vegetable, a pea, the bullet's really, really small, but it doesn't take a very large bullet to do a lot of damage to someone. The gun was favored for its small size. It could be easily concealed inside a pocket. It fired a single round lead ball weighing nearly an ounce and was most accurate at close range. And so again, there's the gun on display. So kind of interesting that they had the actual gun on display. So people usually want to go see that. And so to date, there have been 4 presidents assassinated. All 4 were killed by guns, FYI. A small pistol was hidden in John Wilkes Booth's pocket as he approached the theater box where President Lincoln was seated. His weapon of choice was a compact silver inlaid Derringer pistol weighing barely 8 ounces. Unlike military revolvers that could fire up to 6 times before reloading, the Derringer could handle only 1 bullet at a time. So again, there's a little bit of a debate why he chose this particular weapon versus other ones he had in his possession at his hotel room. When Booth pulled the trigger, the Derringer fired a single round ball. As the black powder exploded and the dull gray bullet left the gun, the air filled with blue-gray smoke and burning gunpowder. The discharged lead ball weighed nearly an ounce, proving to be a deadly shot. They have on display the items that Lincoln had on his possession when he was shot. So he had a little bit of money, he had a wallet, a handkerchief, a couple pairs of glasses, a pocket knife, etc., etc. So these are actually the possessions that Lincoln had on his person at the time that he was shot. And these are also on display in the Ford Theater Museum. So you can see there's a lot of cool stuff to see in the museum before you actually go to the theater. So then you go upstairs, and this is actually the theater itself. So let's talk about this now. It's still a working theater. You can actually see performances here. And so keep that in mind. We'll talk about that in just a minute. And I really recommend walking around and checking out the theater. Of course, this is where the Lincoln was sitting when Booth shot him, and then Booth jumped out of the box onto the stage, ran across the stage and out the back door. But if you get a chance, make sure you come and kind of check things out, maybe sit in a few different seats, kind of take it all in, so to speak. And so that's one of my suggestions for you, is to walk the theater, sit in different sections, etc. Because a lot of people, when they come here, they're tourists, they walk in, they're in a hurry, they just look up at the spot where Lincoln was shot, they take a couple pictures, and then they turn around and walk out the door. So if you have time, I really recommend kind of walking around the theater, kind of the equivalent of when you're drinking wine. You kind of want to savor it and smell the aroma and stuff. And so if you go sit in different seats and kind of imagine what it would be like to be watching a theater performance here on the night of April 14th, 1865, you'll get more of an impactful importance and experience. Let's do a quick video of what it's like inside the theater. Before we do that, though, let's check in with Patty. Patty, how's everything going out there? Anything interesting happening from your perspective, or anything you wanted to interject that we didn't get a chance to cover yet?
No, again, it doesn't matter how many times you go through this history. It's like there's always that. To me, it's a choking up moment when we get to that point where you realize that history has already changed massively once, and just when it seemed to be over, it's about to change massively again. So just the idea of the shock.
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah. Just such an important historic. So that's what's really fascinating about going to Washington, D.C. There's just all these important historical sites that you can go see. So, all right, we'll check back in with you, Patty, a little bit. But yeah, let's watch this video. It'll give you kind of like a 3D overview of what the inside of the theater looks like. So there's no sound with this. They've actually, these are not the original seats, of course, that were there when Lincoln was attending. And they actually reconfigured the seatings because people today are a little bit larger than they were back then. So the seats are larger than they were. And then, so the Lincoln box will be coming up on the left. This is scanning through the seats. So there it is up in the top left corner. That's the box, the presidential box. Important note, when you visit the theater, make sure you call it the presidential box. Do not call it the presidential booth for obvious reasons. The presidential box, what you want to call it. And so again, it's interesting to go through and sit in the different seats in the theater and kind of take it all in and get the different perspectives and different vantage points and things like that. It's really been beautifully refurbished. You can't go inside the actual presidential box. You can kind of peek inside of it, but they don't let people go in there because if they did, people would be, you know, sitting in the chair and hanging off the balcony and doing all kinds of crazy stuff for Instagram or whatever. So they don't let you actually go inside the presidential box, but you can peek inside. This is a FYI. Here's the view from the orchestra. And it's a really lovely theater. It's really been beautifully restored. And so again, when you go here, just kind of imagining what it would have been like to be there on the night of April 14th, 1865, Good Friday of April 1655. All right, there's that. And then another thing, so this is actually still a working theater. They have theater performances on a regular basis, usually in the evenings. So for instance, in recent history, they've had 12 Angry Men, they've had A Christmas Carol, all these other different kind of musicals and plays and stuff. So it's kind of interesting to go there and actually see a performance like that. So if you get a chance, you might want to check that out. There's a little bit of additional costs associated with doing so, but keep that in mind. And then one thing I really recommend if you're going to be visiting is call up ahead of time and find out when the National Park Service Rangers are going to be talking. So this is my good friend, Steve Miller. He's one of the top experts on Abraham Lincoln and the whole entire National Park Service. And so these take place throughout the day, but they're not continuous. So like, for instance, if you go there, they might say something like, oh, okay, well, we're having a talk at 12 o'clock and at 3 o'clock. And so you'd want to time your visit so that you could be there when one of these ranger talks are taking place. So the Steve and his counterparts, they'll get up on stage and they'll talk from anywhere from like 15 minutes to 30 minutes. And they'll describe what took place. They'll answer questions. They'll point out things. They'll tell stories. And so, you know, if you just happen to show up at any random time, you may or may not see these taking place. But if you call ahead of time, you can usually find out when they're going to be taking place and plan your visit accordingly. And so Booth, he was familiar with the theater scene. He was an actor. He had performed at Ford's Theater on numerous occasions. In fact, he had actually previously performed in front of Lincoln. And he finds out that Lincoln is going to be visiting the theater. And so he shows up on that night to assassinate him. He's upset with the direction of the Civil War. He was also mad about Lincoln saying he wanted to give citizenship to African Americans. And he really just wants to take out his frustrations on Lincoln. And so this is the presidential box. Lincoln was sitting in the rocking chair on the left. This is reproduction furniture. This is not the actual furniture that was there the night that Lincoln was shot. We'll explain why a little bit later. And here is the seating configuration. So Lincoln was sitting in this rocking chair on the left. His wife, Mary, was sitting next to him on his right. And then their two guests that evening were Clara Harris and Major Henry Rathbone. So there's 4 people sitting in the presidential box. Lincoln was watching the play with his wife and their guest very peacefully. This is a look down view from the presidential box, just so you can kind of see the stage and stuff. And Booth entered the theater. He didn't really cause any suspicion because he was an actor. People were used to seeing him at the theater. So it didn't really raise any suspicions that he was there. And he sneaks into Lincoln's box and sneaks up behind him and shoots him at almost point blank range in the back of the head. Now, this is an interesting depiction because this was a print from that era. And so this is Major Henry Rathbone. And when he heard the shot of Lincoln, he jumped up. So this is actually kind of like two different events taking place in the same print. So on the one hand, you have Booth shooting Lincoln, and then after the fact, you have Rathbone jumping up. So that did not happen simultaneously like it's depicted in this print. But that being said, it was 1865, and they had to kind of tell the story this particular way. And here's a quote from Rathbone on what he heard and saw that night. He said, "I heard the discharge of a pistol behind me, and looking around saw through the smoke a man between the door and the president." Rathbone was a major in the Union Army. He had seen combat. He knew what a gun sounded like. If you read accounts of other people that were at the theater, some of them recognized it as a gunshot, some did not. A lot of people did hear the sound, but they didn't know exactly what it was. They thought maybe it was related to the performance because it was a comedy. So they thought, maybe this is something related to the play or the musical. But Rathbone immediately recognized it as a gunshot because he was a Civil War veteran of the Union Army that had seen combat up close and in person. And so Booth shoots Lincoln, very cowardly, sneaks up behind him and shoots defenseless Lincoln in the back of the head at nearly point blank range without warning. Now, interestingly enough, Lincoln had invited a few different people to accompany him to the theater that evening. Most noteworthy was the fact that he invited Ulysses S. Grant and his wife, Julia. And Grant initially said that he would attend the performance at Ford Theater with Lincoln and Lincoln's wife, Mary. But then he changed his mind and backed out. And some people theorize it was because his wife, Julia Grant, put the kibosh on those plans because her and Mary Lincoln weren't close friends. And also the Grants were actually traveling from Washington, D.C. up north to visit their family. And so it would have been interesting what would have happened if Grant would have been in the box instead of Major Rathbone. Who knows? And anyways, the guests ended up being Major Rathbone and Clara Harris. They knew the Lincolns, and so they accepted their invitation to the theater that night, not knowing that they were going to be participating in a significant historical event. Now Rathbone hears the gunshot go off and immediately jumps up and confronts Booth. And Booth had dropped his Derringer on the ground, but he's got this big giant Bowie knife with him. And he proceeds to stab Rathbone. They were initially before there was a grappling between Booth and Rathbone. And Booth, trying to get away from Rathbone, stabs him in the arm very severely with this knife and ends up getting away. This is an interesting picture. Again, you have to love the media of the day and how they depict things. Remember, this is before the internet and the present news media. So I can guarantee you 100% that after Lincoln was shot, he did not stand up clutching his head. He immediately bent over. And then Mary was actually on his right, not on his left, as depicted here. And then also the ground, the distance between the box and the stage was much larger than this. But, this would have been put together like by someone that didn't have all the facts. They want to get the story out, give people a visual. So they just heard that, Lincoln got shot by a gun, by Booth, and he had a knife, and they just theorized, well, it probably looked something like this because, at the time, the news traveled much slower. They only had so much information available. This is a little bit more realistic depiction on what happened. And then this is a shot of the theater. So here's the presidential box. And Booth was wearing spurs. If you're not familiar with those devices, there are these metal attachments that go on your shoes or your boots and use them to assist you in riding horses. But they're these prickly things, and Booth's spur got caught up on the American flag. So what he's going to do is he's going to shoot Lincoln, jump out the presidential box onto the stage, run across the stage and out the back door, because he wants to get away, of course. But what happens is his spur, well, because he got tussled up with Rathbone, he was even in more of a hurry. So he wants to get in and get out as quickly as possible. But he ends up tussling with Rathbone, which probably distracted him and broke his concentration. So then he ends up, when he goes to jump over the box, because he doesn't want to go back the way he came to enter the presidential box, because there will be a mass of people out there. So he thinks this is the quickest, easiest way to get out of the theater after he shoots Lincoln. But ironically enough, his spur, his metal spur on his boot, gets caught up in the American flag. And so he falls awkwardly and breaks a bone in his leg. And that really slows him down. And then that breaking of the leg slows down Booth. And that subsequently ends up leading to his capture. So you can almost say the American flag helped capture John Wilkes Booth, ironically enough. So you can go see that. It's interesting to go to the theater and see how far of a drop this is from the box down to the ground. It's 12 feet. So imagine jumping off something that's 12 feet high. Now, Booth was very acrobatic. That was actually one of the things that he was known for as an actor, was his acrobatic ability when he was doing his performances. So he jumps out of the box, runs up to the stage, yells "Sic Semper Tyrannis," or "Death to Tyrants," and then proceeds to run across the stage and out the back door. And this is a print of the time. So Booth had his horse waiting for him. So he had told one of the employees of the theater to watch his horse momentarily while he went inside the theater briefly. And so when he ran out the back door, his horse was there waiting for him. He jumped on the horse. This one guy figured something was amiss and started chasing Booth, but he wasn't able to catch up to him before he took off on his horse and escaped. Now, if you get a chance, you can't do this from the inside of Ford's Theater, but what's really interesting is to go around the back of the theater. And you have to do this on your own. It's not part of like the official, say, Ford's Theater experience. Like, for instance, you can't access the back of Ford's Theater from the inside of the complex. You have to go around. And when I used to lead the walking tours, I'd always take people back here, and they thought it was really interesting because this is where the Booth's horse was, and he actually ran out this door. Now, of course, these metal trash containers weren't there at that time, nor was the car, but his horse was, and it pretty much looks kind of the way it would have back then. And so it's pretty cool to go back here. Now, I've been back here dozens and dozens of times. I've never had any problems. That being said, it is a downtown kind of area, and so you probably want to do it during the daylight or part of a group. I mean, I've never had any problems, but that being said, you never know. There's usually not even anyone back here, but you just want to be careful. So I'd recommend going maybe with one other person at least, or during daylight hours if you can, just to be on the safe side. And so then the Ford's Theater site is back here and to the right. And so Booth jumps on his horse, comes down this spot known as Baptist Alley, and then off this way and escaping down the streets of Washington. So if you're familiar with Washington, D.C., this is the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery and American Art Museum. So Booth, here's Ford's Theater. This is the front of the theater. This is 10th Street. This is the back. He jumps on his horse, goes down this alley, out onto F Street, and then off he goes towards the river, trying to escape DC. And if you're interested, there's a really good pizza place right here, District Pie. Well, there's also another good pizza place over here, N Pizza. Being a pizza connoisseur, I can recommend those. So John Wilkes Booth, again, famous actor, Southern sympathizer, very extremist political views. He was a racist, and he blames Lincoln for the South's misery and suffering. And these were his counterparts the night of the Lincoln assassination. So he has these three guys that were initially involved in the kidnapping plot assisting him that night. These other 3 guys were out of town and or not available. So he had only like half of his crew, so to speak, to assist him on the Lincoln assassination. And so what were the other members doing when Lincoln was being shot? Because Booth acted by himself at Ford's Theater. Well, he had this guy try and go shoot Vice President Andrew Johnson. So Booth's plan, when he learns that Lincoln is going to be at Ford's Theater, is to have some of his cronies knock off some of the other key government leaders in hopes that he can topple the United States government, or at least inflict a lot of damage to it. So he sends this guy, his buddy George, to go shoot President or Vice President Andrew Johnson. There's a picture of him. So he's Lincoln's vice president. At the time, Johnson was living in a hotel in downtown Washington, D.C. It was not uncommon for people back in that day or that era to live in hotels for extended periods of time. So that's where Johnson's residence was. It's now an office building. So this is Pennsylvania Avenue. So the hotel is no longer there. It was called the Kirkwood House. And on the site of the Kirkwood House is a office building. But anyway, this is where President Johnson was staying. And Booth actually showed up there during the day. It's thought that Booth found out around noon that Lincoln was going to be attending Ford's Theater and decided on kind of a spur of the moment to shoot him. So he had to race around town pretty quickly, gathering up as many of his men as he could and making plans. So he visits Kirkwood House and he asks to see Vice President Johnson, told he's not there, but he leaves a note for him on a card. And so this was actually part of the proof of the larger conspiracy to do harm to the US government, was the fact that John Wilkes Booth left this calling card, so to speak, at the hotel for Andrew Johnson. It says, "Don't wish to disturb you. Are you at home?" So Booth wants to know if he's there at the hotel so that he can send his counterpart there to shoot him. Now, the would-be assassin, though, he had reservations about participating in this because he told Booth that he had only signed up for a kidnapping. He didn't sign up to kill anybody. And so they got in a little bit of an argument. Booth told him if he didn't kill him, that he would kill his friend. And so his friend went out, got drunk, lost his courage, and never ended up shooting Vice President Johnson, thank God. And then 2 of his other counterparts, David Harrell and Lewis Powell, they went to go see Secretary of State William Seward, and they were assigned the task of assassinating him. And so this is Secretary of State William Seward. So this is part of the larger conspiracy that's not as well known as the Lincoln assassination. And Seward lived in a house that was just across the way from the White House. The building no longer stands. So this was the house that William Seward used to live in when he was working for Lincoln. And so Harold and Powell show up late at night, and they had a really clever ruse. Seward had been injured in a carriage accident several days earlier, very severely. He was thrown from a carriage and nearly died. And so he was bedridden. He has a metal brace around his neck to protect him. And so the plan was to have Powell show up at the Seward residence late at night and say that he was a courier from Seward's doctor, and he had to bring him medicine and show him how to apply it. So it was going to allow him access to Seward's home and to see Seward. And so the ruse kind of sort of worked. It got him in the house, but he was confronted by one of Seward's sons and not allowed to proceed any further. They end up getting in a fight. Powell ends up nearly killing Seward's son. This fight's taking place. Then he ends up going into the room where Seward was at and stabbing him because he brought a knife and a gun with him. And all heck breaks loose. There was Seward's daughter and a male nurse were in the room with William Seward. The daughter opens up the window and starts screaming, "Murder, murder." The male nurse starts shouting as well and tries to grab Powell so he can't stab Seward, and then causes a commotion. Other people come in the room, and eventually they're able to get him out of the room, the would-be assassin. So this is a photo of Seward's daughter, and then this is a photo of the male nurse. And so eventually they get him out of the house. He runs off after he's outnumbered. But before he leaves, Powell would end up confronting a total of 7 people. He injured 5 of them. So he with his knife, and then also the butt of his gun, he pistol whipped one of Seward's sons. So he caused an incredible amount of damage. Just one guy, he injured 5 people. And then if you think of Booth, he shot and killed Lincoln, and he also injured Major Rathbone. So between the two of them, these 2 guys caused a lot of damage, injured several people, and of course killed Lincoln. The male nurse, who was a member of the U.S. Army, who was looking after Seward after his carriage incident, he was later given a medal and a lot of other accommodations because he essentially saved the life of Secretary of State William Seward. Had he not been there and fought for Seward's life, he would have no doubt been killed. But he intervened, and think of how courageous it would be if you were unarmed, as he was, to challenge a big guy with a knife. That would take a lot of courage, but that's what he did, and he ends up saving Seward's life. So anyway, Booth and 3 of his conspirators are out on the prowl that night. They did a considerable amount of damage to the government infrastructure, so to speak, but think of how much more they could have done had Booth had his full complement of conspirators. So pretty interesting in that regard. So, and then if you're at the theater, as I mentioned, make sure you kind of visit all the different 4 sections. So there's the museum, the theater, and then you go across the street to the Petersen House. That's known as the house where Abraham Lincoln died. This is a famous painting. So after Lincoln was shot, doctors started tending him there and noticed that he's not going to make it. He's got this mortal wound in the back of his head. They realize it's just a matter of time before he dies. And they didn't want him to die at a theater. Reason being is because when you hear the word theater today, you kind of think of, oh, the theater, Shakespeare, and well, that was kind of an aspect to it. Theaters kind of also had a little bit of an unsavory reputation as well. It kind of reminds me of this couple that I know that met at a bar, and they don't like telling people they met at a bar. So they come up with some other story that they met at a barbecue. So kind of a similar thing. They didn't want Lincoln to die at a theater, though that would be very not a good thing. So they want him to die at a home. And he was too severely injured to be taken to the White House. The roads were very bumpy, they weren't paved, and they didn't think that Lincoln could survive a carriage ride from the theater to the White House. They thought he's going to die any moment. He's too severely injured. So they think, well, at least let's just take him across the street to a home and he can spend his last few minutes there. So they take him across the street to this place called the Petersen House. If you get a chance, you really want to visit this. I don't know what percentage of the people that go to Ford's Theater don't go over to the Petersen House, but unfortunately it's quite a few. People are either not aware of this, or they're pressed for time, or they're not interested, or whatever, but it's really a fascinating part of the experience, so to speak, and they oftentimes have these different historical programs taking place there, so you can be on the lookout for that. So again, this is called the Petersen House, and it's known as the house where Lincoln died. And it's part of the Ford's Theater site. Abraham Lincoln died in this house, April 15th, 1865 at 7:22 a.m. All right, so let's hear this gentleman talk about the Petersen House.
The first doctor to reach the wounded president was Charles Leal. He was a 23-year-old assistant surgeon in the Union Army. He did his best to stabilize the president, but he said afterwards he knew that the wounds were mortal. He decided very quickly that they wanted to remove the president from the crowds and the panic in the theater. And so a group of men took the president's limp body outside of the theater, and a man from across the street waved them over into what was a boarding house, the Petersen boarding house. And here the Union officials began to commandeer the first floor of that boarding house. And the men removed the president to the back room where he was laid across diagonally a small bed. The president was 6'4" tall. They propped propped him up and did their best to make him comfortable. And soon the boarding house was beginning to fill with people. Of course, there was Mary Lincoln and Henry Rathbone and Clara Harris. Henry Rathbone still bleeding from his wounds. And now there were also Union military officials, including the Secretary of War, who almost immediately began to organize a manhunt for an investigation of the alleged conspirators for the murderer, the soon-to-be murderer, John Wilkes Booth. There were also political figures who came here. And of course, there were crowds gathering outside. And as people were coming and going, you can imagine the anxiety that was welling up among these crowds, including a number of black residents of Washington, D.C. It was a mixed-race crowd out in that street, and it was a tense moment in the city's history.
So here is the inside of the house, and it's interesting to go back and just see what a home from this era looks like. There's, of course, a lot of historical significance attached to this house, but it's just fascinating to see what was a home like back in Washington, D.C. in the 1860s. And so this gives you a chance. So this is the front parlor of the house, and it's decorated in period. This is really sad. Between visits to her husband's bedside, Mary Lincoln waited in this parlor with her son Robert and friends of the Lincoln family. So she was kind of going back, Mary Lincoln was going back and forth between the back bedroom where her husband was, and when the emotions overtook her, she would be taken up here to the front parlor. And so kind of picture that. And then this is another bedroom. So this was a boarding house. So this was back at that point in time, people that couldn't afford, say, to own their own home would live in these boarding houses. It was kind of like it's basically just like renting a room in a house. It was much smaller than an apartment, and so you have a lot of people living this way in Washington, D.C., especially because there was a housing shortage in D.C. During the Civil War. So this was a large home, has a number of rooms that are set aside for boarders, either people staying for a night, a week, a month, a year, etc. Single individuals, usually men. Usually single women stayed with their families until they got married, or sometimes you had even families staying in this boarding house. And then remember also Mary Surratt, she owned the boarding house. So you can get a glimpse of what the living accommodations were for a number of people in Washington, D.C. Oh, and I didn't read the plaque, but it says down in the kind of bottom center, in this bedroom, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton had held several cabinet meetings, interviewed witnesses, and ordered the pursuit of the assassin. So this is kind of almost like the nerve center of the government for several hours immediately after Lincoln was shot. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton really took charge of the situation and was giving out orders as far as what to do in terms of the investigation and military actions, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a picture of him, and then a sculpture on the left. And then this is the room where Lincoln died. So this is the hallway, and then this leads toward the front of the house. That room that we just showed you a second ago is on the other side of this wall, and then Lincoln is brought in here. So this was, someone was living here. There was a guy living here. He just so happened to be out that night celebrating the end of the war. So they bring Lincoln over here. And so again, the Petersen House, really a great example of what a mid-1800s boarding house was like, which was very common living accommodations for people in cities like Washington, D.C. and New York and Philadelphia and things like that. And then this is the bed. Well, it's not the actual bed that Lincoln died in. I'll tell you about that a little bit later. But it's a replica. And again, Lincoln was 6'4". He was longer than the bed. They tried to actually take this section of the bed off when they placed him in it, but they couldn't. It was part of the frame. So they had to have set Lincoln diagonally. But it's set up the way it would be. So imagine some guy living in here. These are his personal effects, his clothes and stuff. People didn't have as much stuff back then. Typically, they didn't have as many clothes. So this was very common accommodations for people back then. And then there is the bed. So if you can imagine Lincoln's feet down at this end, and then he's laid diagonally with his head over here. And they don't let you go in this room because, again, people would be doing crazy stuff like swan dives on the bed or who knows what. Now, another interesting media aspect of the Lincoln assassination. Again, this is before television, and they did have photography, but it wasn't as prominent. So they have depictions of for people, around the United States and throughout the world of what these events were like. So here's a painting of Lincoln laying on his deathbed. Now notice all these people that are standing around Lincoln and seated around Lincoln. So these are pretty much all the main dignitaries and VIPs of Washington, D.C. Included in this depiction. Now, if you go back to the picture of the room, it's actually pretty small. So there's no way that all of these people were there, and particularly they were not all there at that same time in that same room. But hey, that being said, it's art. It's there to kind of tell a story and show what happened, but it is kind of interesting footnote that not quite exactly the way it went down, but close enough. And then room where Lincoln died, in this room on 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, 1865, an unconscious Abraham Lincoln breathed his last. Mr. Lincoln was therefore unable to witness the nation reunite after its greatest trial, the Civil War. And then the famous quote attached to the death of Lincoln, according to John Hay, one of the president's personal secretaries, the profound words, "Now he belongs to the ages," is what Edwin Stanton, the Secretary of War, supposedly said after Lincoln stopped breathing. Now he belongs to the ages. So imagine that Lincoln was shot at around 10:15 at night on a Friday. It was Good Friday. And there were a lot of people that were out celebrating at that point in time, but there were also a lot of people that were at home and had gone to bed. And so a lot of people did not hear the news of the death of Lincoln until the next day. This is before the 24-hour news cycle. And even people living in Washington, D.C., while a number of them heard about what was going on, a number of them didn't. So kind of imagine yourself, you're in Washington, D.C. It's the night of April 14th, 1865, and you hear that the war is winding down, and maybe you might have even heard that the President Lincoln was going to the theater. And the way that a lot of people found out that Lincoln had been shot and or killed was that they heard the sound of church bells going off the next morning, and very somber church bells. And so people were wondering, God, what's going on? That we've been celebrating the end of the war, at least unofficially, for the past several days. Why are these sad church bells all of a sudden ringing throughout the city? So you can again kind of imagine waking up in Washington, D.C. on the morning of April 15th, 1865, and hearing these church bells and kind of wondering, oh, gee, what's that all about? What's going on? So here's some photos of what Washington, D.C. looked like during the Civil War.
Robert, that's not actually transmitting. I don't know why.
Oh no, oh well.
Like little intermittent beeps of sound.
Oh well. But anyway, pictures of Washington, D.C. During the Civil War. So then, with the death of Lincoln, thanks, Patty, I appreciate that. We'll have to do a new and improved audio playback next time. But anyway, they were just church bells going off. So that's how a lot of people found out about the news. In fact, William Seward, the Secretary of State that had been stabbed during the assassination attempt on his life, that's how he found out that Lincoln had been killed. He was laying in bed recovering from his injuries, and he said, "President Lincoln is dead, isn't he?" Because no one had told him that. And they said, "Yeah, how do you know?" He said, "Well, two reasons. Number one, I know Lincoln, and if he had heard that I was stabbed, he would have come to see me. And number two, I can hear the church bells." And so 3.5 hours after Lincoln died, Andrew Johnson was sworn in as president back at the Kirkwood House in his hotel room. And so then he takes over And so history is going to go on a different trajectory. And then some events in the future. After the assassination, the funeral took place on April 19th. So this was 5 days after the assassination of Lincoln. And famously, Jacqueline Kennedy modeled much of the funeral of President Kennedy, her husband, after the Lincoln funeral that took place nearly 100 years earlier. And then this is in the museum exhibits across the street from Ford's Theater. Next door to Ford's Theater, they have this exhibit on the train. This was the funeral train that took President Lincoln's body and his family from Washington, D.C. back home to Springfield, Illinois. So they recreated the train car, some information on that. So Lincoln's body left Washington, D.C., traveled on this long train route throughout the country so people could get a glimpse of the train and pay their respects. And then it makes its way back through here and before it ends up in Springfield. And if you want to know where Lincoln's buried, it's not at Arlington National Cemetery. He's, of course, buried at the Lincoln Tomb in Springfield, Illinois, which is where he was living before he became president. So if you get a chance, you should check that out as well. All right, so when Lincoln is shot and Seward is nearly killed, people are immediately wondering, what in the world is going on? Is this some kind of conspiracy or what's happening? So investigation into Lincoln's assassination began immediately after the shooting under the direction of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Investigators were led to Mary Surratt's boarding house where Booth had often stayed. So people recognized Booth running across the stage after he shot Lincoln and said, oh, he had something to do with it. And then other people said, oh, you know, Booth, he spends a lot of time at Mary Surratt's boarding house. You should probably go check that place out. And so then the police did. 3 nights later, on April 17th, investigators again visited the Surratt home. So we'll talk more about this stuff in part 2 of our program 2 weeks from tonight. This is the famous $100,000 reward poster that was printed and distributed after the assassination of Lincoln. They weren't sure exactly who was involved initially. They knew Booth was, and they figured Mary Surratt's son John was involved because Booth had been seen frequently at the Surratt boarding house. And they also figured that David Harold was also involved. So they're the 3 people that are pictured on the wanted poster. And look at that, $100,000 in 1865 money. That would be like millions and billions of dollars today. So an unprecedented reward and the biggest manhunt in American history up to this point in time. Now, if you visit Ford's Theater, they have this really cool extra program you can go on. It's a walking tour of the sites around Ford's Theater, and it's led by a person portraying a detective. So imagine traveling around the streets of Washington, D.C. In the area outside of Ford's Theater with a detective from the Washington, D.C. Police Department. And he's going to explain the investigation into how that they figured out it was Booth that shot President Lincoln, and how they determined who his co-conspirators were and how they captured him and all that kind of stuff. So again, this is an extra program, but I really highly recommend it. I've been on it several occasions. It's really cool. And so it's called the Investigation Detective McDevitt. So here's a short video to give you kind of a sneak preview of what you could see if you went on that program.
Was the assassination of the president a lone act or part of a conspiracy? If it was part of a conspiracy, how many people were involved and who are they? Someone had managed to make their way into the state box, and though not everyone in the audience heard the pistol fire, they all saw what happened next. A man, dressed all in black, leaping upon the stage with a shout and making his escape out the rear of the theater. We interviewed some 16 witnesses. I am Major Joseph Stewart of the Army of the Potomac. I was in attendance at the play on Friday evening, seated in the front row with my sister. Their stories indicated that something vast and unprecedented was taking place in Washington at this time. A wholesale assault on the highest levels of government.
right, so there you have it, the extra program that you could go on. So another recommendation is to take the investigation of Detective McDevitt walking tour, which is a little bit extra cost, but it's really worthwhile. Again, I've been on it more than once. It's really cool, and they do a really fabulous job. So give a shout out to them. And then they have information on the Ford's Theater about the escape. I'll talk more about this in the next program in more detail, but just to go through kind of really quickly. The information about chasing John Wilkes Booth. And so again, this is a reason why you want to go over here and not just leave and go home after you exit Ford's Theater, because there's all this extra stuff, so to speak, that you can go visit. Booth actually kept kind of like a mini diary account of his thoughts and feelings after the assassination. And he was recording them in this journal, which was picked up when he was captured. John Wilkes Booth diary. When Booth fled Ford Theater, he carried with him a few items, an appointment book that he used as a diary, a compass, and a Bowie knife. Along his escape route, Booth met up with fellow conspirator David Harold and traveled with him to Mary Surratt's Tavern in Maryland. There they picked up field glasses, also known as binoculars, and a Spencer carbine rifle. Booth's diary provides unique insight into the mind of Lincoln's killer. Booth I should say the deranged mind of Lincoln's killer. Booth expected to be hailed as a hero. So Booth thought that people in the South would be cheering and celebrating him and honoring him as a hero, when in fact, a few did that, but most people were shocked by this senseless act. But instead, he was condemned for his action. He actually thought some people in the North would be in favor of what he did, because Lincoln was, of course, a number of people did not like Lincoln, even though he was reelected. And then here's actually an excerpt from Booth's diary. I struck boldly, and not as the papers say. Well, he struck boldly, but he snuck up behind a defenseless Lincoln and shot him without warning in the back of the head. I don't know if that's striking boldly, but anyway, that's what his opinion was. I walked with a firm step through 1,000 of his friends. What he means is that's the crowd at Ford's Theater. Well, yeah, after you shot Lincoln, you ran out the back door. Was stopped, but pushed on. A colonel was at his side. I shouted Sic Semper before I fired, which is a lie. Because Rathbone, if he would have yelled that before he shot Lincoln, Rathbone would have heard him. And no one claims to have heard Booth say that beforehand. He heard it afterwards. In jumping, broke my leg. I passed all his pickets, rode 60 miles that night with the bone of my leg, tearing the flesh every time I jumped. Boy, sounds so dramatic. You might think he was an actor or something. I can never repent it, though. We hated to kill. Our country, meaning the Confederacy, owed all her troubles to him, meaning Abraham Lincoln. And God simply made me the instrument of his punishment. So it wasn't him, it was God that directed his actions. The country is not what it was. This forced union is not what I have loved. I care not what becomes of me. So he says he cares not what becomes of him, but he tried to escape. That's really interesting insight. I have no desire to outlive my country. So interesting thoughts from John Wilkes Booth. And another interesting aspect of the story is how the news media coverage portrayed this event. Initially, the word just kind of was trickling out that Lincoln had been shot, and then trickling out more that he was seriously injured, and then eventually that he was dead. This is the escape route that Lincoln's assassin Booth took. So this is Washington, D.C. up here, this dark colored section of the map. Washington, D.C. is right next door to Maryland. So Booth fled by horseback down through Maryland, stopped at Dr. Mudd's house, continued his journey south, crossed the Potomac River into Virginia, where he was captured at Garrett's farm. And so they have a little bit of information on that. This is the items that were recovered at Dr. Mudd's house. This is Booth's boot and Dr. Mudd's surgical items, the manacles that Dr. Mudd was arrested by. This is some of the items that Booth had in his possession. So these are on display in the museum. You can see he had an atlas, a gun, a saddle, a toothbrush. Booth was quite a ladies' man, so he had a bunch of pictures of women, a knife, some keys, etc., etc. So it's a long story. We'll talk about it more next time in our part 2 of our program. But the Union Army eventually finds out that Booth is hiding out in a barn at Garrett's farm in Virginia. They surround the barn. They order Booth to come out. He refuses to do so. They light the barn on fire and attempt to flush him out. Booth still doesn't come out, and he's ended up shot by one of the Union soldiers, where he ends up dying. Now, a really interesting thing to do is you can go actually travel this John Wilkes Booth escape route, which is kind of like the premise of our part 2 program we're doing in 2 weeks if you're watching this live on Zoom. But you can actually go travel this route on your own. So back in the day before COVID, we actually used to pile people into our van, and we would actually go spend the whole entire day traveling this John Wilkes Booth escape route. And it's something that you can do yourself. So this was one of our tour groups. We got into our van, off we went. It usually takes like about a full day from Washington, D.C. to go travel all the way through the different sites, including the Mary Surratt boarding house and the Dr. Mudd house and a few other sites along the way. And if you're going to do that, you might as well, if you can, go all the way to the end. So this is the spot where Booth was shot and killed with our tour group members there. And then Assassin's End. This is the site of Locust Hill, Richard Henry Garrett's farm. Early on the morning of April 26, 1865, a 16th New York Cavalry Detachment cornered John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of President Abraham Lincoln, and his co-conspirator David E. Harold, as the two men slept in Garrett's tobacco barn. Harold gave himself up, but Booth refused to surrender. The barn was set on fire, and Sergeant Boston Corbett shot the assassin, Booth, still inside the barn. Booth was laid on the porch of Garrett's house and died about sunrise. The house and barn stood a short distance from the spot. So this property, if you're wondering, like it's an interesting site because a lot of people come here just to go check it out. There's not a lot to see. It's actually, the property is a U.S. Army base, so they don't. It's not super tourist friendly. Like there's no museum there or anything. But it is still interesting to go to the site and see this particular spot where Booth's life ended. And remember back to the slide where Booth's spur got tripped up on the American flag. That really slowed down his escape from Washington, D.C. It allowed the Union cavalry to catch up to him and capture him. And so you can really say that, ironically enough, the American flag helped lead to the demise of John Wilkes Booth. And so Booth died there at Garrett's farm. 4 of the other conspirators were put on trial. Well, actually, several conspirators were put on trial, but 4 of them were found guilty of the highest crimes and were executed. And so they were hung, and a colorized photo of them about to be meeting their demise. And then the floor drops out, and such, etc. So then shortly thereafter, the Civil War finally came to an official close. They had a big, giant 2-day-long victory parade in Washington, D.C. Unfortunately, Lincoln was not alive to see that. Now, at Ford's Theater, the complex, there's a site called, in the part of the museum, it's called the Center for Education Leadership. So they want people to learn about the legacy of Abraham Lincoln. So it's a lot more than just the assassination of Lincoln at Ford's Theater. It's all about the life of Lincoln, the legacy of Lincoln, et cetera, et cetera. So really worthwhile to check that out. And then here's a trivia question for you. What person has had the most books written about him? What person has had the most books written about him? Well, it's not Abraham Lincoln, it's actually Jesus. But number 2 on that list is Abraham Lincoln. He's the second person that's had the most books written after him. In fact, there have been over 15,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln. There's more coming out all the time. So a little bit of kind of contextual information for you. Suppose you wanted to read every single one of these books, every single one of these over 15,000 books written about Abraham Lincoln. If you were able to read 1 book a day, which would be pretty tough because some of these books are pretty long, as you can imagine, it would take you over 41 years to read all the books that have been written about Abraham Lincoln. Of course, after 41 years, there obviously be a lot more books that would have come out. So moral of the story, you better get reading if you want to learn more about Lincoln. And just as, I unfortunately have not been able to read all 15,000 plus books myself, but I have read quite a few. Oh, and so this is basically just, I forgot the moral of the story. So this is essentially a recreation of a bunch of books written on Lincoln. So this is called the Tower of Books. It just goes to show that, you know, Lincoln is just really popular. There's been all these books written about him. And so they made this tower to kind of give you a sense of that. So that's pretty cool to look at. And whatever you do when you go here, don't pull out one of these books, because otherwise the whole thing will come crashing down on top of you. No, I'm just kidding. They have it locked in place. You don't have to worry about that. Although some people probably tried it. Whenever I do these programs on Lincoln, whether they're in person or online, people always ask me, oh, are there any books, speaking of books on Lincoln, are there any books that you recommend, Robert, about Abraham Lincoln, and particularly the assassination? And yeah, there are a lot of great ones. These are three that I really recommend. So the book on the left focuses mostly on the assassination, but a little bit about the aftermath. It's called "They Have Killed Papa Dead: The Road to Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln's Murder and Rage for Vengeance." And it was written by a great local Washington, D.C. author, my friend Anthony Pitch, who unfortunately passed away a couple years ago, but a really excellent book. He did a lot of research. He includes a lot of like contemporary accounts of people that were alive in Washington, D.C. about what was going on at the time of the Lincoln assassination. Then there's this book that's published by Ford's Theater, The Lincoln Assassination at Ford's Theater. Now He Belongs to the Ages. This is more of like a picture book. If you're going to be visiting Ford's Theater, this is a good book to get beforehand, kind of read up on what's there. And then the book that does the best job of talking about what happened after the Lincoln assassination, the manhunt for John Wilkes Booth and his conspirators, is called Manhunt. And it's also written by a great local Washington, D.C. author, James L. Swanson. So you can check those out. So take a picture of that with your phone or a screenshot. Three great books: They Killed Papa Dead, The Lincoln Assassination at Ford's Theater, and Manhunt. Now, what about the objects that were associated with Lincoln? Where are they at now? Well, this was the carriage that took Abraham Lincoln and Mary Lincoln to Ford's Theater, and it's actually in a museum in Indiana, in northern Indiana. They have the carriage that took Lincoln and his wife Mary to Ford's Theater. The chair that Lincoln was sitting in, the rocking chair, is not at Ford's Theater. That was a reproduction. The original chair is at Henry Ford Museum in my hometown of Dearborn, Michigan, which is outside Detroit. So it's a long story how it ended up there. Essentially, they weren't as interested in historic preservation back then as they are now. So the stuff associated with Lincoln got kind of split up and traveled around the country. It's there, so you can go check that out. And then the bed that Lincoln was laying in when he died, along with that painting we saw earlier, is actually at the Chicago Historical Museum. Lincoln had a lot of ties to Chicago, so there's a big interest in his life there, so you can check that out. The coat and clothes that Lincoln was wearing, where are they at? They're in the Smithsonian American History Museum in Washington, D.C., just a few blocks from Ford's Theater. And they have the clothes that Lincoln was wearing and the top hat. Now, he wasn't actually wearing the top hat, the famous stovetop hat when he was shot, but he was wearing one of those that night. He had taken it off, of course, when he went into the theater, because a gentleman does not wear a hat inside the theater. At least they didn't back then. And then if you're interested, does Lincoln have any living descendants? And the answer, unfortunately, is no. Abraham and Mary Lincoln had 4 children. 2 of them survived into adulthood. Robert Lincoln got married, and he had 3 children, and then those children didn't have any children themselves. And so the Lincoln genealogy tree is ended. There are no living descendants, unfortunately, of Abraham Lincoln, but who knows, with DNA and other stuff, maybe they'll do something scientifically. Here is Lincoln's son, Robert. This is at the dedication of Lincoln Memorial. And FYI, C-SPAN every few years surveys presidential historians and asks them who is the best president, who's the worst president, everybody in between. So they rank all the presidents, and consistently every single year, Abraham Lincoln has ended up in first place. So they surveyed the historians in 2000, he was in first place, 2009, first place, 2017, first place, 2021, first place. So Lincoln is consistently rated by historians as our nation's best president. I've actually surveyed people individually in different contexts who their favorite president is, and Abraham Lincoln always comes out on top. Why is Lincoln our best president as considered by historians? Well, there's probably 4 reasons. Number one, he was the commander-in-chief of the Union Army, or the Union military, I should say, Army and Navy, Marines, etc. during the Civil War. He led the enslaved people to freedom, so gets a lot of credit for that. He helped preserve the Union. When he had taken over, the Union was split between the United States and the Confederate States, but Lincoln helps keep us together during the Civil War. And I think last but not least, sometimes overlooked, is Lincoln's personality. He was, honest Abe. He was very smart. He was very compassionate. He was very humble. So I wouldn't think that Lincoln, in addition to all of his accomplishments, kind of an intangible, is that he just seems like a great guy, like a cool guy you'd want to go sit down and talk to. There's a picture of the Lincoln Memorial. So if you're in Washington, D.C., if you get a chance, best thing to do might be to go visit Ford's Theater in the morning and then go check out the Lincoln Memorial later in the day, if you're able to do so. And so that's my suggestion, is to visit Lincoln Memorial. So we got a few more things to cover. But before we do, let's check back in with Patty. Patty, how are you doing out there? Anything you wanted to add in on or compliment on?
One of our Australian friends, Jeff, was asking what time I don't think he signed up yet for the program tomorrow morning, Lexington and Concord, but do you know what time it is Eastern?
Oh, it's at 10 o'clock Eastern. If you want, I can, I'll email the Zoom link. Yeah, so tomorrow morning, thanks for reminding us, Jeff. So tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock Eastern, Washington, D.C. and New York City time, we're having a program by our friend Deirdre O'Sullivan, who's an awesome historian, and she's giving a talk about the American Revolution battles of Lexington and Concord. So I'll send out the Zoom link for that if you want to join. It's not this particular Zoom link, it's a different one. But if you want to join us for that, I'll email the information on that. So thanks, Jeff, and thanks, Patty. I appreciate that.
Yeah, people have been enjoying the program. I cracked up when you were talking about finding out what a 1860s house was like, because I grew up in one.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, I told you, my family's been around for a while. And my father was actually born in that house. Yeah.
Oh, really? Oh, wow.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. My aunts and uncles were all born in that house.
We got to do a program on this house. Sounds interesting.
Yeah, actually, the house is no longer there. That's progress, I guess. But yeah, no, I never would have thought of people needing to find that out, because it's like I just always took it for granted. So I kind of chuckled when you talked about it. Yeah, I told you I've been steeped in history my entire life. I couldn't help it.
Yeah, like maybe that's how you got your start. Wow.
It is, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, I don't know. I've always been curious about that stuff, but like I said, I mean, if you come from a founding family and your particular branch has stayed in that area section, it's like you can't turn around without tripping over something historical. There's so many things in that city named for various members of my family, so it's just weird. It's like growing up in an extended family and you sort of are surprised that anybody doesn't know that, you know.
All right, so that's it. Coming soon, field trip to Patty's hometown. Check out these historical sites.
Oh, it's so different now. So much of it's been knocked down and whatever, but it just, you don't, it's like you think according to your experience, basically. So if something hasn't happened to you, it wouldn't occur to you to think of it. So.
Oh yeah, no, definitely. Well, that's cool. Well, thanks for telling us that, Patty. Appreciate that. What about any final thoughts on the Lincoln assassination, or just Abraham Lincoln in general, before we sign off? We have a few more minutes.
Somebody had asked about Andrew Johnson. This is you have really evolved this program as you've done it, and this is really a nicely organized, complete version. But no, Andrew Johnson was in those days, you didn't do running mates the way you the political calculation was somewhat similar, but there wouldn't necessarily even have been like party agreement. And Johnson was
very different.
Yeah, Johnson was a very, very different figure. I believe he was a Southerner, was he not?
Yeah, Tennessee. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I think
things were very different back then.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why he was chosen. But he was the first president that was impeached, and stop me if you've heard this before, he survived by one vote.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, a lot of things survived by one vote.
Yeah, that's what I mean. It's kind of like nobody's ever been successfully impeached.
Mhm.
Well, they've been tried, but they haven't, been found guilty. But
Mhm.
yes, well, I think 4 now have been impeached, right?
Mhm. Yeah, well, Nixon kind of, was
Oh,
gonna
yeah,
tripped
he
up and resigned.
resigned, given the choice, yes. But yeah, no, this is good.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I forgot to mention my famous trivia question. Where was your host, Robert, engaged at? Well, it was the Lincoln Memorial, of course, where I asked my then girlfriend, Michelle, to marry me, and in the eyes of Abraham Lincoln, she said yes. That
The
was the day
first time you
that was the
ever
day I won the
told us
lottery.
that, Robert, my eyes filled with tears because it was me, you, and Harry all chit-chatting together, and all 3 of us, he's a hero to us, right? I mean, I think Lincoln is truly one of the greatest presidents that we've ever had. And I cannot imagine the country surviving that whole period had it not been for Lincoln.
Yeah, so if you're looking for a cool place to get engaged, I don't know. I recommend Lincoln. I recommend the Lincoln Memorial. Work for me.
Yes, you do. You seem like a happy couple. So yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Great program tonight, though, and thank you everybody for sharing your thoughts and questions. And yeah,
Yeah, no,
hopefully
thank
we'll
you.
see some of you at Lexington and Concord tomorrow.
Yeah, so thanks, Patty. Appreciate that. So as I mentioned, we've been recording this program. It'll be posted on our Washington, D.C. History and Culture YouTube channel. If you get a chance, you should subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have over 100 programs on there of all different types of historical topics, everything from history to culture to music to art, et cetera, et cetera. So be on the lookout for that. And as I mentioned, if you're watching this live, 2 weeks from tonight, using the same exact Zoom link, we'll do part 2 of our program on the Lincoln assassination. And this one will focus on those conspirators and what were they all about, what were they trying to accomplish, and how they get caught. And it's really kind of like a live stream or online or a virtual tour of the bus tour that we do. So if you're not able to go travel the bus route that John Wilkes Booth did during his escape, or if you're thinking about it, want to know what it's like or what it's all about, you can come join us in 2 weeks using the same Zoom link, and we will see you then. And then just FYI, not sure if you're aware of this, but this year is the 60th anniversary of the assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. And so when we get to November, we're going to have a whole bunch of programs associated with John F. Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy and the assassination. It's not going to all be assassination related stuff. There'll be kind of some more positive, uplifting type things. Like in September, it'll be the 70th anniversary of the Kennedy's wedding. So we do a program to kind of picture what would it be like to travel back in time and attend Jacqueline Bouvier and John F. Kennedy's wedding. So we'll do that in September because the Kennedys were married on September 12th, 1953. But in November, we'll have all these programs, and you can join us online or virtually, or if you're in Dallas and you want to come down and check things out in person. I was actually going to lead some tours around the Kennedy assassination site sometime in November. We don't have all the dates for that just yet or the details. Stay tuned and we'll keep posted on that. We're Washington, D.C. History and Culture. We're a nonprofit community organization. All the programs that we do are usually free, and we survive and continue on through donations from regular everyday people. We don't get grants or government funding or anything like that. If you ever made a contribution to support the work we do, thank you very much. Greatly appreciate that. Pays for all of our administrative expenses. And if you want to make a contribution to support the work we do in the future, you can do so by PayPal, Venmo, or GoFundMe. And this information is also included in the event description. So that's the end of our program. I want to thank everyone for joining us. Wish everyone a great Friday evening. Hopefully you're going to have a spectacular weekend. We'll see you either, if you're watching us live, maybe we'll see you tomorrow at Lexington and Concord, or in 2 weeks. We talk about the Booth escape route. Thanks to Patty once again for joining us, and thanks to all of you participating, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, everyone.